Welcome to another episode of Pandemic Dialogues. If you have enjoyed these discussions, please remember to like, rate, or review this podcast to help others discover us. In this episode, we continue our discussion of Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. Trevor and I discuss the first 5 sections of Part 2. Remember that you can engage with us on Twitter by using the hashtags Camus, CAMUS, and ASU. Again, thank you for joining us. And now, Episode 2 of Pandemic Dialogues. Trevor, good to see you again from a socially distant distance.
Yeah, you too, Luke. We're at least 6 feet apart here.
Indeed, and everyone at home is good, I think, for you, or?
Everyone is doing well, thank you. And you?
Much the same. We're doing as well as can be. I think like a lot of Americans, we're just trying to get to the end of this, but I think especially for those of us who are in academe, we are in that state, but also at the end of the year sort of slump. We just want to make it to finals week, but at the same time, we have the added strain of all of the recent move to online and stress. But, other than that, I think we're doing okay.
We're zooming along.
In the last episode, I gave a quick summary of what we were discussing. In this episode, we're not doing all of Part 2, but we're only going to do the first 5 sections, and we will do the rest of Part 2 in our next episode.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as plot summation is concerned, we don't have the same sort of structured directional narrative as we've seen in the past. So just quickly, we begin now with Oran in quarantine. We're seeing some of the consequences of quarantine. The narrator does address some of the behavior of the Oranians, who seem to fluctuate from a kind of everydayness to license, among other things. We have additional reflections on the part of the narrator, quite extensive, in fact, regarding things like exile, love, and various important themes, which we'll likely touch on. There are a number of characters that we hadn't seen for a while are reintroduced, and there are some important exchanges among some of them, especially that between Rieu and Rambert, who engage in a very interesting discussion regarding abstraction, which we'll want to talk about. We have, of course, in the third section, Father Panelou's homily, his sermon, followed by a number of responses to it, which include Grand and his literary project, and then ultimately Rambert and his somewhat reconciliation with the officials that have imposed upon him the impossibility of leaving. So let's dive in.
I have a question for you about something you just said, but I do want to make a quick comment that I thought it was very interesting that some of these characters that we are reintroduced to, like Rambert and Father Panelou, were ones who only got a very brief mention in the early pages. It's almost as though, at least I had thought that they were going to be minor characters, or maybe we weren't going to see them again at all. But obviously, it looks like we're going to see a lot of them, including Rambert, who is originally from Perez, but is now, as we discover, trapped in this city. And I thought that was a kind of neat way of sort of literary character involvement on the part of Camus. But you had mentioned that some of the themes we see are love and exile. What exactly do you mean by exile?
Yeah, well, it's a word that's used rather frequently in the opening pages by the narrator here. And there are 2 types of exile that are addressed, at least explicitly. That which is referred to as the exile in one's own home, and then there's the exile of those who are away from home, like Rambert, who you just mentioned. And so the whole section opens with this note that everyone sort of realizes that they're in it together, that there's maybe a kind of self-conscious we that has formed in the face of this threat and this calamity of the plague. But it's not clear that they're a coherent community, per se, and that there's a real sense of solidarity. I mean, perhaps this is what it means to be exiled at home. Where is home after all? I mean, to be home and the desire to return home is in all of our hearts. I mean, to find oneself at home. And perhaps the suggestion is that one is most at home when one is with others. I mean, we are social, political, relational beings. And to be in exile is somehow to be without the face-to-face human contact and the bonds and even institutional arrangements that allow for our relationships and our lives to flourish in the way that we deeply desire. So this exile at home seems to be manifest in the lives of the Oranians who are indeed in their their town. And then you have those who are, like I said, exiled away from their actual homes, which also demonstrates how not all spaces or places are treated equally in our minds or in our hearts. I mean, there are certain places that we desire to be. There are certain people with whom we'd rather be with. There's something natural about loving what is one's own. To be home with one's own is somehow to be not exiled, and to be exiled is somehow the opposite of this. Part of what's being demonstrated here is the question of what is home and what it takes to make a home and thus a proper flourishing life. Just one other point, if I could. I mean, there seems to be a kind of exile temporally as well, where the narrator writes that, we returned to our prison house and we had nothing left but the past. And even if some were tempted to live in the future, they had speedily abandoned the idea. So there's another form of exile here where it's as though we're exiled from the possibilities in the present, exiled from the hopefulness of the future, and relegated really to the past, to be confined almost to a state of nostalgia and to not be able to see what's before one. And like I said, the possibilities for an exile in another way.
In describing the phenomenon of exile and the ways in which many of the residents of Oran, as well as these major characters that we are reintroduced to, one of the things that occurred to me is that this process of going from being in exile and forming a community where one maybe did not necessarily exist. Everyone is originally consumed with their own self-interest, their own good, their own desires, and a community has to be formed from this lot. But it's not a linear process. There's descriptions about the town recognizes that they're in it together, but then almost, within a couple of pages, there's a description about how everyone is still on holiday and the cafes are full, even though other places are closed off. It's very similar to the kinds of things we're experiencing today with our own pandemic. Different people are responding to this crisis in various ways, some of which seem very self-centered, but I think Camus is suggesting two things. One, that's really a form of coping with the realization that, as you pointed out, the present and the future have been taken away from us, and we can only really deal with nostalgia and clamoring at a state park or a beach or a cafe and pretending to thumb our nose at this disease that's running rampant and unchecked is really a coping mechanism. But moreover, I think there's also this point that we don't go from a collection of random individuals into a community overnight. There's a process through which we have to come to know who our neighbors are. And there's a process through which we have to get rid of this self-referential way of thinking. And there's a lot of pain and agony that's going to happen with each of these characters as they form this new community.
Yeah, it really raises the questions of what are the foundations of and what can bring about genuine human solidarity. I mean, we do hear this kind of trope sometimes that, well, the whole world would be unified if we were attacked by aliens, right? Or that somehow large gatherings of people will be formed into a cohesive whole in the face of a common enemy. And so again, the question of what can form a community in advance of this so that there is some persistent appreciation for the common to form and shape people such that they do understand themselves as members of a community, such that they are not caught off guard and in the midst of panic trying to come together without any deeper resources on which they can draw.
That's a really good insight about the ways in which we contemporaries fool ourselves into thinking about external threats. If aliens were to land, we would be unified. Or people who talk about global warming, why can't we sort of unify into a world community? It reminded me of the novel Ender's Game, which is about that very problem. It's a science fiction novel. Aliens have attacked the Earth and they're unified into world government, but the Cold War was put on pause. And one of the themes that you see in that book is that those political fault lines are overcome only to the extent that the larger existential threat are present. And as soon as you get towards the end of the novel, when that alien race is overcome, you see those political fault lines, which had been put on pause for a period of years, is suddenly back. This is, I think, again, not to digress too far, is kind of what we're seeing, that it's actually really hard to make a political community because you need more than just legal status of being from the same town or from the same nation. You need more than just ties of language, or even more than just the cultural ties or familial ties or racial or ethnic ties. There's something more that is beyond what we can sort of observe empirically. And yet we know that it's there because we look at communities like France or Iran or the United States or Japan or Australia and recognize that it is an independent community. So what we're seeing here in the novel is it wasn't really a true community. We're seeing all of these kinds of fault lines of individuals and groups and families having concern only for themselves and not really recognizing the gravity of what's really befallen the community, even though, as the narrator says, they were in this together.
Yeah, it seems to be a sort of passing realization of a we, but then a quick return once again to the I. And I mean, this is a problem. This tension between the I and the we is perhaps inescapable. And it's also not to suggest that genuine solidarity rests upon some real strong sense of collectivism, doing away with the individual and the individual's dignity. But by no means, nor can one properly imagine a political community without maybe different parts or factions and the like. But even in the midst of all of these differences, disagreements, partisanship, and parties, can there still be something common that's commonly held and something that is committed to by the individuals? And no doubt this takes some kind of shaping and formation to come about. It is not simply, well, maybe the argument is it's not simply a product of having a commercial port or outpost somewhere and expecting this will emerge spontaneously.
Speaking of the journalist Rambert, we are reintroduced to him after a considerable amount of time. We might have thought that he was only going to be a minor character and not make a further appearance, but now we see that he's back and he's stuck here. He is one of these exiles who are not from Oran, but are nevertheless now part of this new quarantine. And he comes to Ryu, our main character, asking for a favor, and they have a contentious exchange. Could you maybe elaborate that story for our listeners?
Yeah, there is something interesting happening here. Rambert sees the doctor Ryu as an official who might be able to help him in his case as he's trying to find an exception to the rule and the law that's been laid down. It is interesting that early on, when the narrator says that there is this common threat and that there is this sense that everyone is in facing this plague together, there will be no exceptions, and privileges were one of the first things to be dismissed, and sort of exceptions to the rule were not to be granted. Well, here we have this character, Rambert, who is asking precisely for that, for the help of the doctor to circumvent the rules so that he might leave during this time of lockdown. And the doctor responds by saying, well, first of all, there's nothing I can do to help you. I'm simply not in the position to be able to aid you in this matter. I don't have the power that you may imagine me to have. And Rambert interprets this as a character flaw on the part of Ryu and accuses him of engaging in abstractions, of not actually having the kind of compassion or pity that is necessary to appreciate the situation within which Rambert finds himself. Curious thing, of course, because Ryu seems to be a character with deep compassion and pity, but it's a kind of pity for those who are suffering in the more immediate or obvious sense of their bodies in a medical way, of a physical kind of pain. But what to make of this notion of abstractions and this accusation?
No, I think this discussion about the abstractions is very helpful. But let me quote a kind of extended passage from this part of the novel in section 2. Rambert raised his voice a little. That's a quotation from the book. And then he goes on, but damn it, doctor, can't you see it's a matter of common human feeling? Or don't you realize what this sort of separation means to people who are fond of each other? Ryu was silent for a moment, and then he said he understood it perfectly. He wished nothing better than that Rambert should be allowed to return to his wife, and that all who loved one another and were parted should come together again. Only the law was the law. The plague had broken out, and he could only do what had to be done. No, Rambert said bitterly, you can't understand. You're using the language of reason, not of heart. you live in a world of abstractions. That's the end of the quotation. I think this could be taken on a first reading as yet another accusation that Ryu speaks the language of Sanjus, the raw, cold, uncaring reason of law that Rambar wants to criticize, and that he wants something more, and he's revealing himself to be a kind of Rousseauian who wants compassion for his case, concern about me. What about my exception? What about my beloved? What about the fact that I'm not from here? And he's arguing not really in a kind of logical or even legal way, but he's arguing from the point of view of a feeling. But ultimately what we see is that it's Rambar who is the one living in abstractions, because Ryu is a doctor, and as we soon discover in just a few pages, that Ryu is in charge of one of the auxiliary hospitals. He is tending to the sick every day. He has heard this same appeal for compassion and exemption, not just every day, but multiple times every day, from the minute he wakes up until late at night, sometimes past midnight when he gets back from his rounds of dealing with this thread. And ultimately, it's this journalist from Perez who's dealing with an abstraction, the abstraction of his case as being somehow exceptional.
Or maybe he's engaging in the very error that he accuses Ryu of committing. I mean, to the extent that he sees Ryu only thinking in terms of abstractions, that is to say, generalities, he, in fact, is only thinking of his particular case. He cannot see beyond his own particular desires and mediate something in between, when, as you nicely suggest, it's actually Ryu who's doing just that very thing. I mean, he is considering the larger whole, but also ministering to, in a medical way, the pain and suffering of so many individuals, so many particular individuals. So he can somehow balance, to at least a better degree than Rambert, this common good of many and the particular needs of certain individuals.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I think just after the passage that I quoted, there's a kind of summary statement from Rambert that he again accuses Ryu of talking in this language of abstraction. And Rambert says, quote, "You'll soon be talking about the interests of the general public, but public welfare is merely the sum total of private welfares of each of us." And there's a lot of ways we could take that, but I think ultimately what we're seeing, at least in Rambart's character, is that he doesn't believe in something like the common good. He only believes in the private good of the self. This is what we might think of as a liberal thought. And I'm not sure if Camus, the writer, is asking us to completely critique or reject liberalism, but there's a Lockean theme here about the individual. This echoes in some ways that very opening line that plague was now the concern of us all. I think what plague did to this town, or is in the process of doing to this town at this point of the novel, is making a community out of a collection of random individuals. It's making something cohesive and whole out of the various parts.
Yeah, that would certainly be the ambition or the hope. And as we were saying before, it seems to be something that was lacking, at least to a degree, in Oran. But no doubt there is a critique of a kind of utilitarianism or calculative approach to the community on the part of Rambert. I mean, he's not from Oran, right? So on the one hand, he, as an exile, he has less of an attachment, or no attachment to this community. It is seen by him as a place for, an opportune story about the colonial experience that he could write about for his fellow Parisians. There's an intelligibility to Rambert's response. But it is interesting. I mean, I want to ask you what to make of the later reflections that Ryu himself has after this exchange, because there is something about pity here that I think we want to discuss. And Ryu's relationship to pity. On the one hand, he seems to be this compassionate individual, even if there's nothing he can do about Rambert's case, or perhaps that's not the direction in which his pity ultimately applies. So on the one hand, there is something about Ryu's pity that's important, but then he later suggests here, or the narrator suggests, quote, "Ryu had learned that he need no longer steel himself against pity. One grows out of pity when it's useless, and in this feeling that his heart had slowly closed in on itself, the doctor found a solace, his only solace, for the almost unendurable burden of his day. This, he knew, would make his task easier. And then finally he adds, to fight abstraction, you must have something of it in your own makeup. Abstraction sometimes proves itself stronger than happiness.
I think on some level, every human being abstracts. It seems to me that it's fundamentally a part of human cognition in the same way that I abstract the concept of an apple so that when I see apples in the grocery store, I don't need to reinvestigate them and figure out whether or not I kind of have an abstraction of what I think I'm looking for. And so that's necessary. We also need to abstract because in order to pursue anything, we have to have a vision of what that looks like. We talked about in one of the previous episodes that to do a thing as it ought to be done presupposes that you have a vision of what that looks like. That's a kind of abstraction. And so I think what Ryu's character tells us is that we need some level of abstraction in order to combat against it. But abstraction itself can be a kind of vice or character flaw if we allow everything to be a form of an abstraction. When we move everything up to the level of doctrine and theory without any real justification or without allowing the human mind to move between the various stages of imagination as we work toward a goal that we're after, but rather, assert as though it's from on high, some kind of abstract conclusion that needs to be followed no matter what, then abstractions can be problematic. And I think that's what we're starting to see in this exchange between these two characters.
So is it then that maybe Camus is suggesting prudence or a proper form of judgment comes out of balancing, as you've nicely described, abstraction on the one hand, but also recognizing the importance of a compassionate or emotional response, and maybe combining, as the text even suggests, sort of the language of reason with the language of the heart? Is that the right way to think about this?
I think that seems right to me. Plato and Aristotle and other of the great thinkers often talk about a kind of tripartite nature of the soul, right? There's kind of this rational part, there's this energetic or thumotic part, and then there's kind of the passions or the goal of any real philosophy or the goal of any real contemplative way of life is to put those parts of our soul into a kind of harmony. And usually I think it's advocated that reason is the ruler and it tells what these other parts should be doing. That doesn't mean those other parts are not valuable. And so the passions that we experience, if I have the feeling of love, whether it's, romantic love for my wife or parental love for my children or filial love for a friend, those are real, meaningful passions, but they should not rule my decision-making processes in the way that it seems to be ruling Rambar. Rambar seems to be a slave to his passions because he can only see as far as his passions tell him what he wants, which in this case is to get back to Paris and to get back to this common law wife of his. It's revealed that he's married, but not really married, but if he's effectively married. And I think that's what's going on in the narration, that what we see is to have any one of these things, whether it's reason or the passions or other parts of our psyche, rule to the point that it shunts out or excludes out the other parts of the human soul, is a kind of flaw, right? It's a kind of cognitive misstep, and that real prudence, real statecraft, real governance, a real political response to anything has to look at all these various parts and move them together in the right proportion, which is not easy to be sure, but I think that's the goal that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and it just occurred to me as you were speaking that there's something about the novel form to show us how these kinds of insights develop within particular characters in response to or in and through their relationships with one another. Ryu, as we've said before, does not begin or appear as some sort of perfect character. His reflections are induced on the basis of the interaction he has with Rambert. And I think similarly, we'll see, it remains to be seen just how Rambert responds and whether his assessment or his original assessment of these decisions and the character of Ryu are correct.
That's all really good. Thanks for that insight, Trevor. Should we move on to this homily of Father Paneloux, which seems to be a kind of fulcrum for the narrative thus far?
Yeah, no doubt. It is an important section, and we see a number of responses and discussion of it later. So let me ask you what the best way to think about this is. I mean, it clearly does follow from some of the earlier discussion as well, insofar as this third section opens with this line, but where some saw abstraction, others saw truth. So what do you make of this homily or sermon from Father Panelu, and how ought we think about him?
Father Panelu is one of these other characters that we saw very briefly in the opening pages, and would have thought, or maybe even up to this point had thought, if we were first-time readers, that he was merely a minor character. We hadn't heard from him in a long time, and suddenly he's back. We learned before, when he's introduced, that he's a Jesuit.
A militant one.
And we see now that he's actually a very learned scholar of St. Augustine and the African Church. It's worth mentioning, I think, that both Oran and Hipporegius, which is where Augustine was from, were both in Algeria. There's not just this spiritual legacy, but there's very much a kind of ethnic or even cultural legacy or heritage that you find in both of these characters, Father Panelu, Augustine, Oran. All of this is relevant, and I think obviously Camus would want us to know that. What I found important is that we're told this in passing as Father Panelu is asked to give a sermon on this plague that has befallen the city of Oran, and desists, or otherwise puts away for a fortnight, for 2 weeks, his work on St. Augustine. And that tells us, the reader, that he knows Augustine forward and backwards, or at least is sort of working toward that. But the sermon that we get is incoherent on Augustinian grounds.
So where's the incoherence as far as Augustine is concerned, or the Augustinianism?
The gist of the sermon, as I take it, is that Father Panelu is telling the parishioners, the people of Oran, that the plague is their fault, right? They have fallen away from a sort of militant observance of Christianity. And about halfway through the long chunks of the sermon that are quoted, Father Panelu says to the effect that there's this golden legend about the king of Umberto, Italy, when it was swept by plague, and how a good angel was made visible, giving orders to an evil angel, directing with a kind of agency of God, physically saying, pick that house and pick that other house and skip that one, but pick that one. And that's not the Augustinian view of God's agency. And even a rudimentary reading of Augustinian philosophy would suggest that that's problematic. In one of Augustine's more well-known writings on free choice of the will, it's one of his earliest writings, we get a depiction or a theory of good and evil, wherein Augustine teaches that evil is a privation. It's the absence of a good. Evil has no existence in and of itself. Its only existence is there, so to speak, insofar as there's a good that's missing. But moreover, the main thrust of the argument of how evil exists in the world, insofar as God is concerned, is evils that befall us that God thinks are necessary are things that he permits. And so God, in Augustinian thought, does not go out with a first-person agency, but rather is passively allowing something through. And he's allowing it to occur in order to teach everyone a lesson before God would resume his mercy and rid the town of plague. Now, Augustine scholars might quibble with how I'm depicting the full details there, and there's a lot more nuance, I think, that would take longer than we have time for. But what I think is relevant is what we're getting from Father Panelu is not an Augustinian view of good and evil. It's not an Augustinian view of how we should take the plague. And that, I think, would complicate the way that we should take Father Panelu, because that means he himself has already made a strategic decision about rhetoric, about what he thinks is necessary to teach his audience. Or maybe at another level, it's Camus who's trying to tell us something about religion.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, what is the suggestion then in terms of the strategic approach? I mean, it seems to me he offers this kind of fire and brimstone installation of fear. This is a moment for everyone to stop and think, and indeed get onto their knees as well. So it's more than just thinking. But then it ends with this appeal to a prayer out of love. So is this part of what you're suggesting in terms of the strategic approach? And then, and what more in terms of the complication of the character Panelu?
There's a well-known quote from Augustine that is often translated as love and do what you will. That, I think, is the real Augustinian theme that you're zeroing in on the way that Father Panelu ends his sermon. So I think your suggestion at interpretation is getting in the right direction. He's given this fire and brimstone sermon that isn't really Augustinian, but the ending of it is. It's an appeal to a prayer of love, and God will see to the rest. So you have this love and do what you will, love and go out and worry about your business. One of the Augustinian themes that you find, this appeal or command to love your neighbor, is one of the main themes in Augustinian thought. We need to love one another and loving God in order to get out of self-love. It's self-love that ultimately becomes the most destructive kind of love because it's self-referential and it ultimately ends with a contempt for God. But to love our neighbor is a way of training ourselves to love God. And so I think what Father Panelu might be doing then, if we want to sort of take the rhetorical theme here, is that he seems to be opening with a kind of more emphatic, dramatic, bombastic way of presenting what's going on to grab their attention. And once he's grabbed their attention, gives them the most important part of the sermon, which is to love God and allow him to take care of the plague.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, there certainly does seem to be a religious complacency in the town of Oran. And maybe this is Camus' critique of contemporary religion. I mean, it's that even the religious are not serious with their religiosity. But does the sermon have any effect, really? I mean, what are the consequences of this sermon, I guess, is one of the questions to consider. But also, I mean, since we spoke about the language of the heart, or the logic of the heart and that of the mind, coming back to that opening line here, suggesting that here's someone who's responding with the truth, I mean, in the face of abstractions. Is it the case that it's this language of the heart or the language of love? I mean, as you say, Augustine is, of course, very focused on the heart and love.
Think about it this way. We are given this sermon from Panelu, which on the surface looks almost like a caricature of a bad priest. And I think it's supposed to lead the audience to be unsympathetic toward him. But given what we've just said about Augustinian thought, there's another way of reading this as a kind of comparison to the language of the heart that Rambart was asking for earlier. And his language of the heart was completely self-referential. He wanted compassion. He wanted the language of the heart for himself. But Father Panelu is telling us to go love our neighbor. And he doesn't use that language directly, but I think we can read the sermon as an appeal to realize that what we need to do is something like what Ryu is doing, which is having a concern for all of those who are sick, and realizing that our biggest duty is to look out at our neighbors, our family members, the person down the hallway that we never talk to in the apartment building, etc., and just make sure that everyone is doing okay, and do so in a way that puts, from Father Panelu's position, Christian charity rightly understood at the heart and center of our behavior and our actions.
Yeah, that's nice. So to the extent that maybe our first, or many readers' first impressions is to not take Father Panelu seriously, perhaps on the basis of what you're saying, Camus does indeed recognize the possibility of a religious or Christian charitable response as being a legitimate one, if indeed it too is serious in some way.
Yeah, that's right. I think in one of our previous episodes, we talked about how theological tradition is something to which Camus wants us to be skeptical about, as well as the intellectual or secular tradition as a kind of source of authority and knowledge and received wisdom. And a lot of that is being called into question, and we are invited in many ways to be Socratic skeptics towards a lot of these things. Camus doesn't want to take the easy way out by just ridiculing religion or just ridiculing science or just ridiculing religion. Maybe he wants us to be skeptical of those, because even if we ultimately return to our faith, return to liberalism, return to science, we do so from a much more intellectually stronger foundation of those traditions, and we do so without a kind of unreflective way wherein we don't really know what those traditions are really about, but we do so in a way that gives it a much more deeper sense of richness and vitality.
Yeah, so something that's not simply rote or maybe dogmatic and taken in an absolute manner, so that it's not just the language, or that we're not just mouthing the pieties, whether of science, religion, liberalism, and the like, but indeed we understand this to the extent that it is articulate for us and maybe even experiential. We understand it. It becomes a part of our being such that it so orients our lives and we live it in a full sense or in a rich sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think we can take this section here on Father Panelou's sermon as a kind of first exposition, a first character exposition of three, because we see his exposition and then we see two other expositions, all of which are responding to this problem of abstractions, which is unfolded in those first two sections.
Yeah, it is curious, though, that as the fourth part opens, or fourth section, rather, the narrator says, it is hard to say if this sermon had any effect on our townsfolk. So there is this ongoing dialectic about the gravity of the sermon and the sort of cavalier manner in which it's responded to. But moving on to some of these other responses to the abstraction, I mean, what exactly do you mean by that? What's the second response? If Father Panelou is the first response, then what is potentially the second?
Well, the second response is this novel that Joseph Grand is writing. And just to preview, the third is a return back to Rambar and his final acceptance of his state. But in this new section, we're given more insight into Grand as a person, as well as this novel that he's writing.
It's hard to know whether one should take this section seriously or not. I mean, what in fact Camus is getting at here. I mean, and we raised the question of this Grand character and his struggles with language and the broader problem of language last time. But here we find him working on this novel. He seems to have some sense of honor and perfection in mind. I mean, it needs to be flawless, and he imagines this work being received when it's completed with great praise. And yet he can't seem to execute the task. I mean, so is his response one that he has let perfection become the obstacle of the good?
That's how I took it. Grand's flaw is that he takes perfection, the abstract nature of a perfect prose, to such an extreme level that he's incapable of doing the practical. We realize that maybe perhaps one of the things holding him back from advancement is not that he was denied the raises that he was promised as a young man, but in fact that he himself failed to execute the duties that were assigned to him early on in his career, writing a report, etc., because he had this vision of perfection, and because he so consumed himself with trying to get toward perfection, he never got there. This is kind of what I think we're seeing with Grand.
To be paralyzed by an ideal, maybe. And yet it doesn't seem to be all that high-minded of an ideal. And I guess on the other hand, Grand is a seemingly decent fellow, I mean, by all other accounts. So let's return to the discussion of Rambert in the third response. I mean, as you say, he comes to a sense of reconciliation, perhaps with Rieux's position, at least to a limited extent. I thought it was quite also funny, maybe in the way that he offers a categorization of the different bureaucrats, right? I mean, he refers to them as the sticklers, the consolers, they're the very important persons, the triflers, the red tape merchants, the overworked officials, the much harassed officials, and the traditionalists. So he's clearly spent a lot of time categorizing the administrative or the bureaucratic branch of government, but you say he's reconciled here. So how so?
This section opens describing another way that people are responding to this new atmosphere of growing panic, and uses Rambert as a kind of example for that type of person. And so in many ways, Rambert is the character, the classification for this typology. But what we see is, in all of his attempts to get out of the town, Rambert is finally kind of confronted with the realization that nothing is going to help, right? Because just after he's given this description of all of these classifications, the narrator describes, quote, "These fruitless interviews had thoroughly worn out the journalist." So he's worn out. He's done. He realizes he's not going anywhere. And he's given Just after this one glimmer of hope, we're told, when a form was sent from the prefect's office. Fill this out. Who are you? What's your income? Who are your loved ones? Where do you live? And Rambar is excited. He's like, great. They want a CV, a curriculum vitae, which is just another way of saying a resume. He's ready. And then he finally realizes they want it for contingencies. What are those contingencies? In the event that this journalist from out of town perhaps catches the plague and dies, the city of Oran, the government officials, want to know whether or not they can go to the family of this deceased person and recoup some of the funds of treating him and taking care of his burial. That's the real sucker punch, I think, that really gets Rambar to realize he's not going anywhere, because not only is he not getting any real answer from anyone about a possible exemption for getting out of town, all his efforts have amounted to is the city realizing that maybe they should at least have a little bit of information on him in the event that he dies.
It seems much more than the journalist, as you say, is exhausted and he's sort of giving up the fight. I mean, rather than, I guess he's accepting his lot, but maybe this is one of Camus' ways of showing just how the officialdom and bureaucracy can wear an individual down such that he does accept his fate, and the most he can do is then delve into a kind of categorization of the officials and the encounters that he...
That's right. But it's also important to remember that that's a phase, as is the next phase of depression. It's described as a period of sheer lethargy. But in describing it as the next phase, this lethargy that the narrator then describes, he's at least signaling to us that Rambar is going through these various stages. You know, we nowadays think of the stages of grief, and some of them have already kind of mapped on to Rambar, because first there's an attempt to negotiate with everyone. He goes to the doctor, he goes to all these officials. Then there's a sense of anger, or at least frustration. Why can't they see his plight? Then you finally go into this, what seems to be a level of depression, of realizing that you're never going to get home, and maybe you're going to be stuck here forever. You might die here. I suspect that in the coming pages, beyond what we're talking for this episode, we will see a version of Rambar who, in some way, shape, or form, has come to accept his fate for the extended period that this plague lasts on the town.
Yeah, we shall see.
But there's a kind of playfulness in these sections, and the way that the narration of these sections is choppy, it's nonlinear. We see the community moving from levels of being okay and almost as though they're on holiday, the streets are packed, moving to levels of panic. We see certain individuals who are at different stages of dealing with all of this panic, and all of it's almost pictorial. Again, it's, as I've said before, it's nonlinear. Something that stuck out at me when reading the section on Grand and Rambar, Grand, in talking about his novel and wanting it to be perfection, says something to the effect of that once his words have the exact tempo of this ride. His first sentence was a woman on horseback in a park in Paris, and wants the very sentence itself to be so perfect that it conveys that kind of cadence. And of course, Grand, as we know from an earlier passage, is a student of Latin and would have read Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid is a story of exile and of founding a new home. But in the opening lines of the Aeneid in the Latin, one or two of those lines are written in a way that fit the Latin meter, but have a very choppy cadence, because you're reading a section about Aeneas being tossed about the sea, but the Latin itself has a kind of rough, choppy cadence, so it doesn't have this kind of poetic flow to it. I think that's what Camus is doing. We get these rough, impressionistic character expositions. We get multiple threads of the city moving about in its various stages of dealing with the plague. The individuals are at different stages of dealing with it all at the same time. We don't really know where it's going, obviously, in this next part, but at least these first couple of sections can lead us to a disoriented way, because we ourselves are descending along with everyone else in the novel to this kind of new reality that we haven't really hit the new normal yet. We're still in the process of getting there, and we don't really know where it's going to end up, but right now we're just as disoriented or tossed about as all of the characters.
Yeah, no doubt. There is a muddling through that we are sort of facing in our own lives today.
Welcome to Pandemic Dialogues from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This series seeks to sustain the intellectual community we built with students, ASU colleagues, and the wider community while our regular speaker events are postponed. We offer the dialogues in two modes: a series of live webinars, each discussing a great work on pandemics and civic crisis, and this podcast, with extended discussion of Camus' novel, The Plague. More on the dialogues and the school is at scetl.asu.edu.